The bombardment ceased on the 15th day of April in 1945. When the morning arrived without the thunderous explosions that had rattled their underground refuge for what felt like an eternity, Greta discovered that the absence of sound frightened her far more than the deafening crashes of shells had ever managed. She held Hans, her 8-year-old son, and tiny Maria, barely 5 years old, pressed against her body in the pitch-black basement, her voice nothing more than a whisper as she promised them that the American troops would arrive any moment now. The propaganda machine had spent months filling every German mind with horrifying images of these foreign soldiers, painting them as creatures who would harm innocent children without hesitation. Yet when Hans, his mind clouded by the delirium that comes from extended hunger, dragged himself toward the intoxicating aroma of American field rations being prepared over an open flame, the impossible unfolded before their eyes. Eddie, a young soldier whose family had emigrated from Poland to America, witnessed this skeletal German child approaching and made a choice that violated every military rule in the book. The chocolate bar he extended came with memories of his grandmother's voice echoing through his consciousness, instructing him to feed the hungry as she would have done, to put children above all other considerations, always and without exception. This singular moment of compassion began dismantling the barrier of animosity that separated supposed enemies. The monsters described in the warnings never materialized because these were simply human beings selecting humanity over hatred. The quiet descended with the sharpness of a knife cutting through fabric. Following 72 hours of relentless artillery fire that had shaken loose clouds of dust from the cellar's overhead beams and driven little Maria to burrow even deeper into her mother's protective embrace, the unexpected stillness felt fundamentally wrong in every way. Greta Mueller positioned her face close to the basement's single narrow window, her exhalations creating temporary fog on the filthy glass surface as she attempted to see through the small opening between stacked sandbags. The devastated street above showed no signs of movement except for a single stray feline navigating carefully through the wreckage of what had previously been the Hoffman family's residence. Hans shifted position beside his mother, his 8-year-old body displaying the sharp angles of prolonged starvation, his ribs creating visible ridges beneath the fabric of his tattered shirt. His voice emerged as barely more than a rasp when he addressed her, the sound damaged by excessive thirst, asking whether the danger had finally passed. Greta's hand located his shoulder, her fingers detecting the prominent bones just beneath his skin's surface. They had survived 3 full months concealed in this underground space, sustaining themselves on watery turnip soup and hardened bread fragments, their ears constantly assaulted by the sounds of warfare raging in the world above them. 3 months had elapsed since the official letter arrived bearing news of Johann, her husband, killed somewhere along the Russian front after attempting to abandon his military post. She had incinerated her membership card for the ruling party that very same night, observing as the flames consumed what she now recognized as elaborate lies she had once accepted as truth. She murmured soothing sounds to Hans, though her own heart hammered frantically against the cage of her ribs. The American forces were approaching. This fact was common knowledge throughout whatever remained of their community. But understanding something intellectually and witnessing it with your own eyes represented entirely different experiences. The rumbling began as a low vibration, similar to thunder heard from a great distance, then expanded into the unmistakable mechanical growl of numerous engines. Greta's breathing stopped momentarily as the initial military jeep rolled past the window opening, its olive-coloured paint showing chips and splashes of dried mud. American soldiers occupied the vehicle's interior, their helmets pushed back at casual angles, cigarettes dangling from their mouths in relaxed fashion. One soldier laughed at some comment made by his companion, the sound travelling clearly through the broken glass fragments above their hiding place. They appeared remarkably ordinary, remarkably exhausted, bearing no resemblance whatsoever to the propaganda images that had covered every available wall surface throughout the town for years, depicting Americans as savage beasts with blood-stained fangs and clawed hands ready to tear apart innocent victims. These were merely young men, some appearing barely older than adolescent boys, consuming coffee from metal containers and sharing what appeared to be chocolate bars among themselves. The smell reached Hans before anything else, and his voice carried urgent, desperate hope when he told his mother he could detect the scent of real food. Greta's nostrils caught it as well, the rich, unfamiliar aroma of American military rations being cooked over a small fire somewhere in their vicinity. Her stomach contracted with a hunger so profound and long-lasting it had transformed into a permanent physical ache. When had any member of their small family last consumed a complete meal? When had little Maria last spoken in anything louder than the faintest whisper? Greta heard herself giving the automatic response she had repeated for months like a protective mantra, instructing Hans that they must remain hidden, that staying concealed meant staying alive, that trusting anyone was no longer possible. But Hans was already in motion, his emaciated legs propelling him toward the cellar stairs with a determination that filled her with terror. She hissed his name urgently, commanding him to stop, but he was 8 years old and suffering from starvation, and the smell of genuine food possessed greater power than fear could ever hope to match. Greta watched in mounting horror as her son pushed open the cellar door and stumbled out into the morning brightness. Her legs felt as though they had frozen completely to the floor, every survival instinct within her screaming to move, to grab him, to pull him back down into the safety of shadows. But what exactly constituted safety anymore? Death by slow starvation, or death by American bullets? What kind of impossible choice was that to force upon a mother? Through the grimy window, she observed Hans emerging onto the street, his body swaying slightly as his eyes struggled to adjust to direct sunlight after so long in darkness. He resembled a ghost child, pale and skeletal, his clothing hanging from his frame like rags draped over a scarecrow's wooden structure. Approximately 50 meters distant, gathered around a small cooking fire, 3 American soldiers sat perched on wooden crates, steam rising visibly from whatever meal they were preparing. One of them noticed Hans first, a young soldier possessing kind eyes and dark hair, probably no older than his mid-20s. He spoke to his companions, gesturing in the boy's direction. Greta's heart ceased beating entirely. This was the moment, she thought. This was precisely how her son would die, shot down in the middle of the street for committing the crime of being German and hungry. But the young soldier made no move toward his rifle. Instead, he rose slowly to his feet, his movements careful and deliberately unthreatening. He spoke words in English, his voice carrying a gentle quality, then reached into his pocket and extracted a rectangular brown package. Greta had seen sufficient quantities of American supplies during recent weeks to recognize the item immediately as a chocolate bar. The soldier extended it toward Hans, his facial expression soft, displaying something that looked remarkably similar to genuine compassion. Hans advanced one tentative step forward, then another, his small hand reaching outward with the desperate hope that belongs only to children who have experienced far too much of war and far too little of basic kindness. And in that precise moment, observing her son accepting food from the hands of an enemy soldier who chose mercy over vengeance, Greta felt something crack open inside the center of her chest, something that had been locked away and sealed tight since Johann's death, since the bombs began their relentless falling, since the entire world transformed into a place where neighbors vanished during the night and children learned to fear their own shadows. It felt dangerously similar to hope. Private Eddie Kowalski observed the skeletal German boy materializing like a ghost from the rubble, and his initial instinct directed him to reach for his rifle. 3 full years of military training had drilled into his consciousness that every civilian represented a potential threat, that every shadow might conceal an enemy combatant. But something about the manner in which this child swayed on his feet, the way his ribs showed clearly through his torn shirt, reminded Eddie powerfully of his nephew Tommy back home in Detroit. Same approximate age, same way of regarding the world with eyes far too serious for childhood innocence. The expletive escaped from Corporal Flynn's mouth as he sat beside the cooking fire, his voice expressing shock at the child's physical condition. The boy advanced another hesitant step forward, his gaze locked onto the chocolate bar in Eddie's hand with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't eaten properly in months, possibly longer. Eddie had witnessed that particular expression before, in his grandmother's stories about fleeing Poland, about standing in bread distribution lines in Chicago when his family first arrived in America as immigrants. Hunger was hunger, regardless of what language you spoke or what uniform you wore. Flynn asked what the hell Eddie thought he was doing as Eddie stepped closer to the boy, extending the Hershey's bar toward him, reminding Eddie that this was enemy spawn standing before them. But Eddie was already kneeling down, bringing himself to the boy's eye level, employing enough German learned from his grandmother to manage basic communication. He spoke the word for here softly, offering the chocolate, adding "for you" in his broken German. The boy's eyes widened dramatically, darting between Eddie's face and the chocolate bar, as if attempting to determine whether this represented some kind of elaborate trap designed to harm him. His small hand trembled visibly as he reached out, then pulled back in fear, then reached out again with renewed courage. When his fingers finally closed around the chocolate bar, Eddie observed tears beginning to track downward through the dirt covering his cheeks. The boy whispered his thanks in German, his voice barely audible above the ambient sounds of the damaged town. Eddie was preparing to respond when movement in the shadows captured his attention. A woman emerged from what appeared to be a bombed-out cellar entrance, her dress showing evidence of multiple patches and repairs, her blonde hair dulled by accumulated dust and the effects of malnutrition. She moved with the careful wariness characteristic of someone who had learned through bitter experience to expect the worst from every human encounter, her eyes scanning the American soldiers with an expression combining terror and desperate hope in equal measure. This had to be the boy's mother, Eddie concluded immediately. She appeared young, perhaps in her early 30s, but her face carried the weight of someone who had aged years within the span of mere months. Her hands shook visibly as she approached, clearly fighting against every survival instinct commanding her to grab her son and run away from these armed foreigners. She called the boy's name softly, her voice carrying a slight tremor of fear. The boy looked back at her, chocolate already smeared across his mouth, and something in his expression made Eddie's chest tighten with emotion. It was pure joy, uncomplicated happiness, the kind of expression that made Eddie wonder when this child had last tasted chocolate, or any sweet thing at all. The woman spoke rapidly in German to her son, words Eddie couldn't follow or understand, but her tone clearly communicated gentle correction mixed with fear for his safety. She was probably instructing him to be careful, to come back to her side, to not trust the American soldiers no matter how kind they appeared. Eddie couldn't blame her for that protective instinct, not after everything she had likely experienced. Eddie addressed her respectfully, standing slowly and ensuring his hands remained visible and non-threatening. He attempted his broken German again, trying to communicate that it was good, that they were safe. The woman's eyes met his directly, and Eddie observed something flicker in their depths, recognition perhaps, or simply the desperate calculation of a mother attempting to keep her child alive by any means necessary. She spoke additional words in German, pointing to herself and then to Hans, and Eddie caught the word for mother clearly. Eddie nodded his understanding, then pointed to himself, providing his full name. He gestured toward the cooking fire, where Sergeant Martinez had been observing the entire exchange with quiet interest. Eddie tried to communicate the concept of friends in his limited German. Martinez broke the tension by stepping forward with both hands raised peacefully. Unlike Flynn, who continued muttering about regulations and enemy civilians, Martinez had grown up hearing stories about crossing borders while hungry, about strangers who chose kindness over suspicion when they could have chosen otherwise. Martinez announced quietly to Eddie in English that there was enough stew for everyone, then attempted his own broken German, asking if they wanted food. The woman, whom Eddie would later learn was named Greta, shook her head quickly in refusal, but her eyes lingered on the cooking pot with unmistakable longing that betrayed her true feelings. She spoke again, gesturing toward the cellar entrance, and Eddie caught enough words to understand she was communicating something about another child, a smaller one still hidden below. Without waiting for permission from anyone, Eddie ladled stew into his mess kit and handed it directly to Hans, then grabbed another portion and offered it to Greta with no strings attached. She stared at the food for a prolonged moment, her internal battle playing out visibly across her face as pride warred with hunger, as suspicion fought against hope. Finally, she accepted the bowl with hands that shook so severely Eddie thought she might drop it entirely. She whispered her thanks twice, the words carrying the weight of months of desperation and suffering. As she and Hans shared the stew, passing spoonfuls back and forth between them, savouring each bite as if it were the finest meal they had ever tasted in their lives, Eddie found himself thinking about his grandmother's voice from his childhood, her instructions echoing across the years. "You feed hungry people," his grandmother had always said. "You don't ask their politics first, you don't check their passport or their nationality, you just feed them, because that's what makes us human beings instead of monsters." Watching this German mother feed her starving son with American rations, Eddie understood for the first time in his young life that the real enemy wasn't the people trying desperately to survive against impossible odds. The real enemy was the hatred that told them they couldn't help each other, the ideology that insisted on maintaining barriers between human beings who shared the same fundamental needs. 7 days passed like a fragile dream that might shatter at any moment. Each morning brought Hans emerging from the cellar at the first sound of American jeeps arriving, no longer resembling the skeletal ghost child who had first stumbled toward Eddie's offered chocolate bar. His cheeks had begun filling out slightly with regular food, and something resembling childhood curiosity had returned to animate his eyes. He had mastered saying thank you in English, the words tumbling from his lips with careful precision whenever Eddie handed him a ration or shared his morning coffee. Eddie discovered himself looking forward to these daily encounters more than he cared to admit to his fellow soldiers. There was something profoundly healing about watching Hans slowly transform from a frightened shadow into a boy who might last laugh again, who might reclaim some portion of the childhood that war had stolen from him. The kid had started bringing small gifts as expressions of gratitude, smooth stones he'd discovered in the rubble, a bent spoon he'd polished until it gleamed in the sunlight, wildflowers that somehow managed to grow defiantly between the broken bricks of bombed buildings. Corporal Flynn commented one afternoon that Eddie was getting soft, but there was noticeably less bite in his voice than before, less conviction in his criticism. Even Flynn had started setting aside portions of his rations, claiming he wasn't hungry when everyone knew perfectly well he was saving food for the German families living in the ruins. The letter from Eddie's mother arrived on a Thursday, transported by a supply truck from the rear lines where mail accumulated before distribution. Her handwriting appeared shaky but determined, the words written in Polish that Eddie translated aloud to Martinez as they sat beside their evening fire. Eddie's voice grew thick with emotion as he read that she was proud of him, that she believed he was remembering what she had taught him about feeding hungry children regardless of whose children they happened to be. She wrote that this was how they resisted the hatred consuming the world, not with bigger guns or more powerful bombs, but with full bellies and kind hands extended across the boundaries of conflict. Martinez nodded his understanding completely, his own family having fled Mexico during the revolution, carried across the border by strangers who asked no questions about politics or allegiances, only whether the children needed food and water to survive. Martinez observed that Eddie's grandmother sounded like a wise woman. Eddie continued reading, explaining that his grandmother had survived the pogroms in Poland by hiding in the cellar of a German family, that they had risked their lives to keep her safe, feeding her their own bread when they barely possessed enough for themselves. She had always wondered what happened to that family, whether they survived the chaos that followed, whether they knew how much their kindness had mattered. It was Greta who broke through the language barrier first, approaching Eddie the following day with carefully practiced English words she had been rehearsing. She asked whether his family came from Poland, her accent thick but her meaning crystal clear. Eddie nodded affirmatively, surprised by the question, confirming that his grandmother had come from Warsaw. Something shifted noticeably in Greta's expression, a recognition that went deeper than mere language could express. She spoke slowly, searching for the correct English words, explaining that her neighbour before the war had hired a Jewish family, that their name was Kowalczyk, similar to his own surname. The connection hit Eddie with the force of a physical blow to the chest. Kowalczyk and Kowalski represented variations of the same Polish name scattered across Europe by war and displacement and immigration. It was possible, even probable, that their family stories had intersected long before this particular moment in the rubble of a devastated German town. Eddie asked gently what had happened to them, to her neighbour and the Jewish family they had sheltered. Greta's face darkened with painful memory. She explained they had been taken in 1943, all of them removed by force. She paused before adding with quiet dignity that she had burned her party membership card that very night, unable to continue pretending, unable to keep believing in obvious lies. Over the following days, their conversations deepened significantly, moving beyond basic exchanges about food and safety. Greta told Eddie about her husband, Johann, explaining how he had been conscripted against his will, how he had attempted to desert his post and been executed by his own officers for the attempt. Eddie shared stories of his family's journey to America, the discrimination they had faced upon arrival, the unexpected kindness of strangers who had helped them survive and establish new lives. Little Maria, who had remained silent for so long that Eddie had begun wondering if she possessed the ability to speak at all, suddenly surprised everyone one afternoon with a single word spoken clearly. She said chocolate in English, her tiny voice bright with hope and expectation, and both Eddie and Greta burst into genuine laughter, the first real laughter Greta had permitted herself since 1943. Other American soldiers began noticing the change in atmosphere around their encampment. Private Johnson from Alabama started teaching Hans simple English phrases during his free time. Corporal Rodriguez shared photographs of his own children back home, pointing out similarities between his daughter Rosa and little Maria. Even the unit medic, Doc Patterson, began checking regularly on the German family's health, quietly treating Maria's persistent cough and Hans's infected cuts without making any official record of his actions. Flynn muttered one evening that this wasn't regulation behaviour, but he was simultaneously sharing his Lucky Strike cigarettes with Greta, who had admitted she hadn't smoked in months due to complete lack of access. Martinez replied while watching Hans help Eddie clean his rifle, a task that would have been absolutely unthinkable just weeks earlier when the sight of weapons sent the boy diving for cover in terror. Martinez suggested that maybe regulations didn't cover everything that mattered in life. Eddie composed letters home describing the good Germans he had encountered, people who reminded him precisely why they were fighting this war, not against the German people themselves, but against the hatred and ideology that had poisoned so many minds across Europe. His letters described children who could still laugh and mothers who worried about their babies, families who had suffered under the same regime that had brought war crashing down upon the entire world. During those golden days of late April, with spring finally breaking through the debris and destruction of winter, everything felt possible in ways it hadn't before. Hans was learning to read English words from Eddie's letters home to his family. Maria had started singing lullabies her father had taught her before departing for war and his eventual death. And Greta had begun believing that perhaps, just perhaps, not all soldiers were monsters who followed orders without thought, and not all enemies remained enemies forever if given the chance to see each other as human beings first. The future stretched before them like an unwritten story, full of hope that neither side had dared to imagine during the darkest days of conflict. The new commanding officer materialized on a grey Monday morning in a pristine jeep that appeared as though it had never witnessed actual combat. Lieutenant Blake stepped out with his uniform pressed sharp enough to cut glass, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and a clipboard thick with regulations tucked firmly under his arm. Eddie knew immediately, with the certainty that comes from military experience, that their fragile world was about to shatter into pieces. Sergeant Martinez called the unit to attention, and the men scrambled to form proper ranks for inspection. Eddie's heart sank as he noticed Hans watching from the cellar window, probably wondering why the Americans suddenly looked so serious and formal. Lieutenant Blake appeared younger than Eddie had expected, perhaps 28 years old, possessing the kind of rigid posture that spoke clearly of military academy training and a deep need to prove himself worthy of his officer's bars. He surveyed the camp with calculating eyes, taking careful note of everything: the scattered ration tins, the extra cooking pots, the small pile of gifts Hans had left near Eddie's sleeping area as tokens of friendship. Blake began addressing the assembled men, his Georgia accent sharp with unmistakable authority, explaining that he had been sent to restore proper military discipline to their unit. He informed them that it had come to command's attention that there had been irregularities in their conduct with enemy civilians, unacceptable deviations from established protocols. Eddie felt his stomach drop sickeningly. Beside him, Martinez's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of his internal reaction. Blake continued consulting his clipboard, announcing that effective immediately, there would be no fraternization with German civilians whatsoever. No sharing of rations, no unofficial aid programs, no social contact of any kind. Food supplies were to be distributed exclusively to displaced Allied prisoners and American personnel. He asked whether this was understood by all present. Martinez spoke up carefully, addressing Blake as Sir, noting that these were non-combatant civilians, women and children who had no involvement in military operations. Blake cut him off sharply, stating that they were German nationals, enemy nationals whose country had started this war and whose government bore responsibility for untold American casualties. He declared that they were not a charity organization, but the United States Army. Eddie watched through the window as Greta emerged from the cellar, probably expecting their usual morning exchange and distribution of supplies. She had Hans and Maria with her, and Maria was clutching the small wooden doll that Doc Patterson had carved for her just days earlier with his own hands. They looked so hopeful, so trusting, that Eddie felt something break inside his chest with almost audible force. Blake continued speaking, announcing that furthermore, Private Kowalski was being reassigned to convoy duty effective immediately, that he would be departing with the supply run the following morning at 0600 hours. The words hit Eddie like a physical blow delivered with full force. He attempted to speak respectfully, addressing Blake as Sir, noting that these families had been depending on their assistance. Blake's voice carried the cold finality of absolute authority when he responded that these families were not Eddie's concern, that his concern was following orders and maintaining military discipline. Blake gave him 48 hours to pack his gear and say whatever goodbyes were necessary to his fellow soldiers, pointedly not mentioning the German families. As the men were dismissed from formation, Eddie walked mechanically to his bunk and began stuffing his few possessions into his duffel bag with hands that shook noticeably. His hands trembled as he folded his grandmother's letters, the ones that had given him strength to choose compassion over blind compliance. Through the window he could observe Greta still waiting by their usual meeting spot, Hans tugging at her dress and pointing excitedly toward the American camp. When she finally realized something was fundamentally wrong, Eddie watched her face transform completely. The hope died first, visibly draining from her expression, replaced by a familiar wariness he thought they had moved beyond, then hardening into something that looked like resigned bitterness born of repeated disappointment. She gathered her children protectively and turned back toward the cellar, her shoulders set in the posture of someone who had been disappointed by soldiers before and should have known better than to trust again. Hans said something in his careful English when Eddie finally approached their cellar that evening, carrying his last chocolate bar and a small bag of flour he had managed to requisition from supplies. Hans reported that his mother had said the soldiers would leave eventually, that she had warned all soldiers make promises they don't keep in the end. Eddie started to explain that this wasn't his choice, then stopped, realizing the futility of his words. How could he possibly explain military hierarchy to an 8-year-old child? How could he make a boy understand that adults could be forced to break promises they desperately wanted to keep? Greta appeared in the cellar doorway, and Eddie observed that the walls had gone back up behind her eyes, the defensive barriers reconstructed. The woman who had laughed at Maria's first English word had vanished completely, replaced by the suspicious survivor who had first emerged from the shadows weeks ago, expecting nothing and trusting no one. She said simply, her English flat and emotionless, that he was leaving, just like all soldiers eventually left. Eddie tried to protest, to explain, telling her please that he didn't want to go. She interrupted him, stating that what he wanted did not matter in the slightest, that orders mattered, that they understood orders perfectly well. Her voice carried the bitter weight of someone who had watched too many uniforms make and break promises over the years. She said they had been foolish to think, to hope for anything different. She didn't complete the sentence, simply gathered her children and disappeared back into the cellar, closing the door with quiet finality that felt like a physical barrier. Eddie stood there in the growing darkness, holding his useless offerings, understanding that in Greta's mind he had just become another soldier who had used their desperation for his own comfort and then abandoned them when convenience and orders demanded it. The following morning, as his convoy pulled away from the town in a cloud of dust, Eddie observed Hans standing at the cellar window, holding the empty chocolate wrapper he had treasured for weeks as his most precious possession. The boy didn't wave goodbye and farewell. He simply watched with the hollow expression of someone learning that the world's cruelty proved more reliable than its kindness. That disappointment was the only certainty worth believing in. 2 weeks down the road at his new posting, Eddie would still taste the bitterness of that moment on his tongue, still hear Maria's voice saying chocolate in perfect English to an empty room that held no Americans anymore. 3 weeks had elapsed since the convoy dust had settled back to earth, and Hans had stopped speaking entirely, retreating into silence. He sat motionless in the corner of the cellar, clutching the chocolate wrapper that had become his most precious possession, the only tangible proof that their brief taste of kindness had been real and not some fever dream born of hunger and desperation. Maria barely moved anymore, her small body curled against Greta's side like a wounded animal seeking the last remaining warmth in a dying fire. Greta stared at the empty chocolate wrapper in her son's hands and felt the weight of her own foolishness pressing down on her chest like a physical burden. She had permitted herself to believe, had allowed hope to crack open the careful walls she'd constructed around her heart for protection. Worse still, she had let her children believe, had allowed them to think the world might contain kindness that lasted longer than a few stolen moments. Now Hans looked at every American uniform with the hollow eyes of someone who had learned that kindness was just another weapon adults used to hurt children more deeply. The decision came to her in the grey hour before dawn, when the cellar felt more like a tomb than a shelter, when breathing itself seemed like too much effort. They were going to die here, slowly and quietly, forgotten in the rubble of a war that had already moved on to new battlefields and new victims. But perhaps, if she surrendered herself and the children to the Americans, they would at least feed Hans and Maria in whatever prison camp they sent them to for processing. Prison rations would be measurably better than no rations at all, better than watching her children waste away gram by gram. She dressed the children in their cleanest clothes, which wasn't saying much after months of living in a cellar, and braided Maria's hair with fingers that shook only slightly with the effort of maintaining composure. Hans asked no questions, which frightened her far more than his earlier tears had frightened her. 8-year-old boys should ask questions constantly, should fight against plans they didn't understand or didn't like. The fact that he simply nodded acceptance and took Maria's hand without protest told Greta how completely she had failed to protect his spirit from breaking. The American checkpoint was located a quarter-mile away through streets that resembled broken teeth jutting from damaged gums. Greta had prepared her speech in careful English, practiced the words that would surrender her family's freedom in exchange for her children's survival. She would inform them she was a German civilian seeking aid, that she possessed information to trade for food if necessary, that she would work in whatever capacity they required of her. Anything to keep Hans and Maria from starving to death in that cellar while she watched helplessly. But as they approached the checkpoint with slow steps, a familiar voice called out from behind them, breaking through her resignation. The voice asked whether she was Mrs. Mueller. Greta turned around and felt her heart stop beating entirely. Eddie Kowalski stood 20 feet away, appearing older than she remembered from just weeks earlier, carrying a canvas military bag and wearing an expression of such profound relief that she wondered if she was hallucinating from hunger and exhaustion. Hans whispered Eddie's name, the first word he had spoken in days, the name emerging like a prayer or a question. Eddie dropped his bag immediately and covered the distance between them in quick strides, kneeling down to Hans's eye level in that same familiar way he had positioned himself that very first day. He greeted the boy, telling him he had heard they might need some help. Hans said with wonder filling his voice that Eddie had come back, the statement carrying disbelief and hope in equal measure. Eddie pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, explaining that he had brought something for Hans, a letter from his grandmother that she wanted him to read aloud. He unfolded the thin paper with careful hands and began translating the Polish words into English, his voice carrying across the checkpoint where other American soldiers had begun to gather and listen. He read his grandmother's words, her instruction to feed them as she would feed him, her reminder about the German family that had fed her when she was hiding from those who wanted to hurt her. "Children first," the letter said. "Always children first. This is how we remember that we are human beings, not just soldiers, not just enemies, but human beings who choose kindness when the world around us chooses cruelty." Sergeant Martinez stepped forward from the group of gathered soldiers, and Greta observed something like understanding pass between him and Eddie without words. Martinez said quietly that regulations were one thing, but a grandmother's wisdom carried more weight than Lieutenant Blake's clipboard could ever hope to possess. Other soldiers began nodding agreement, sharing glances that spoke of their own memories, their own families who had crossed borders while hungry, who had been fed by strangers who asked no questions about politics or nationality or which side of the war they supported. Private Johnson pulled a chocolate bar from his pocket in offering. Corporal Rodriguez produced a can of peaches from somewhere. Even men Greta had never met before began offering food, small gifts, quiet words of welcome spoken in broken German or simple English. Eddie stood to face Greta directly, explaining that they couldn't change what had happened, that he couldn't undo the orders or the leaving, but he could tell her that some of them had never stopped thinking about her family. Some of them had never forgotten that feeding hungry children was more important than following regulations that forgot children were children, no matter what language they happened to speak. Lieutenant Blake appeared at the edge of the gathering, his clipboard conspicuously absent from his hands. For a moment, Greta thought he would order his men to stop this unauthorized distribution, would reassert the regulations that had torn their fragile community apart just weeks earlier. Instead, he looked at Hans, really looked at the boy standing there, and something shifted visibly in his expression. Perhaps he was remembering his own son back in Georgia, the baby he had never met in person, the child who would grow up in a world shaped by the choices adults made in moments exactly like this one. Blake addressed Sergeant Martinez, stating that he believed they had some surplus rations that needed to be distributed for humanitarian purposes, his voice lacking its earlier sharp edge. As Hans reached for the chocolate bar Private Johnson offered with a gentle smile, his small fingers finally releasing the empty wrapper he had clutched desperately for weeks, Greta understood something that would stay with her for the remainder of her life. The surprise hadn't been discovering that Americans could be kind to their enemies. The surprise was understanding that human beings, regardless of their uniforms or their languages or which side of the conflict they represented, could choose to plant seeds of compassion in soil that had been broken by hatred. And sometimes, if they tended those seeds carefully enough with consistent acts of kindness, something beautiful could still manage to grow even in the most devastated landscape imaginable.